Hello, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are continuing our discussion on Some Are Always Hungry by Jun Young. Today, we will be focusing on our favorites from the first half of the collection.
Well, we're putting some more quarters in the podcast so that we can continue. As Vanessa was saying, today we're going to be looking at just about the first half of this very powerful debut collection from Jun Young. We were talking pre-show about which poems we wanted to cover, and maybe even before we get to the poems, we were talking last time about the epigraphs, and so the epigraph for the whole collection, I don't think we talked about it, but it's an American poet, Li Young-yi Lee, who writes, "Of wisdom, splendid columns of light, waking sweet foreheads, I know nothing, but what I've glimpsed in my most hopeful of daydreams, of a world without end. Amen." So it's an interesting epigraph because it kind of it puts up this prayer to the world of hope and dreams and light. And it's kind of this almost like reminds me of epics with their invocations, right, to the muse. So this is what the words that wrap around Young's collection, and then we get to a poem that opens the collection by the name of All Female on page 3. On page 1. I know you all said you all wanted to talk about this one, so
Absolutely.
What did y'all want to say about the opening poem?
Yeah. Well, I know Vanessa, you want to talk about the end of the poem, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll kind of like lead into it. I'm always fascinated how poets put together their collections of work, and it's fun to see themes and places and names, common threads come out all throughout. And so I'm always fascinated how they decided to organize these throughout their collection. I think this is a great first poem because I think it really does. In addition to the epigraph, sets up the rest of the book, not just in name, but also in theme. And so, even I think I mentioned this in the first episode, there are a lot of teachable things about this poetry in terms of technique and form and just, I think, beautiful writing. I think sometimes we overanalyze technique to death that we forget about the beauty of it all. And her description here, the first stanza, sets up this book that's filled with women, and it sets up from the very first stanza, we know that it's going to be very food heavy. And as we've discussed in many episodes of this podcast, food is so important in culture. Right. It's, culture is the way we live our everyday lives. And so many of us grow up with memories and nostalgia for recipes, for the ways our mothers or family members made certain recipes, that it can't compete with anything else. And so in this case, right, we learn a lot about some of the food because we're looking at women in the market. And in terms of imagery, it's just like an explosion of imagery, because she's talking about the sounds, the gurgling tinks, and the women talking in the streets, talking prices for all these. And then you also just have the imagery of all the seafood that's there. And again, cracking open. There's a violence there from the very first stanza that I think is planted, and it grows throughout the book. And the very last line of the first stanza kind of sets up moments, I think, throughout the rest of the book. It says the men watch game shows as we wreck the girls' bodies for Ro, and I don't know why. So she mentions kind of like men and men's role and like kind of them watching game shows or TV, or we see that a lot, like watching sports, whatever. And the women in the working, doing kitchen work, or and in this case, the fact that she draws attention to the fact that they're wrecking bodies, and in this case, particularly female bodies. In this case, they're talking about the crabs that they picked up from the market. Um, there's so much, and she sets up her visceral imagery at the early onset of this poem, and it grows throughout the book as well. And I know it leads into some cool imagery, and I'd love to talk about some of that. I do have some for the very last stanza of this poem, but Vanessa, I know you wanted to talk about it as well, so go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned themes because I feel like the emphasis on how much, I mean, of a matriarchal culture this is. So there's like a really heavy emphasis on women throughout and like the sacrifices that they make for their families. So like in the third stanza, it says, "It's always the girls for everything. When was the last time you've heard of rooster soup? We put the bodies to boil in salt and broth." And I thought that was really interesting because I sat there and I thought about it. I was like, what other food is it that we eat where it's not the female? So I don't know.
Was that it for the poem, or did you have the last stanza as well?
No, I only have that one.
I highlighted a couple of things that I thought were pretty nice and interesting about the last stanza. First of all, there's just, I think, a very beautiful image, I guess, that doesn't necessarily have much to do with like themes of the poem, but I love the way it's written. And it says, outside the winter interrogates our windows fogged. Like, what a awesome way of just saying the windows are fogged, right? But like winter interrogates our windows. Lovely imagery. But she does this thing here where, again, I think where this poem sets up maybe the tone for the rest of the book. There's this kind of dream sense or dream world in which she imagines a hypothetical situation of the crabs escaping their boiling death. She uses a little bit of anaphora here and the repetition of the hypothetical if. I think she does this a little later on too with the word say. Like so she creates these hypothetical situations, and I think it's the realm of the fantastic that she brings into this world of hyperrealism of violence. And she, it's beautiful because it's like a dream of escape. It's not all in one piece, but the very last couplet, and these girls, she's referencing the crabs, rise up from their pot, untangle their legs from the perilla and leek, so from whatever it's being added to. So the legs are already detached, but they grab them and they make for the sea with their limbs and their teeth, which is, I think, what a wild image that amplifies what I was just kind of mentioning. It's fantastic. It's wild. It's a little silly, crazy, but it works. And I think what she's trying to do here, at least what I feel, obviously, right? And it works, and it sets up the rest of the poems, I think, really well.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm really enjoying just listening to you both talking of breaking this poem down for listeners. So I don't mind just being the fly in the wall, by the way. But I think what y'all are just making really good comments about the crafts, right, of this first opening poem, setting the bar, right, for the rest of the collection, the themes that also run throughout the collection. I like how in the first stanza, I was looking up a lot of these things, right, and for Ro, like it's I guess from the eggs from the ovaries, and so there is that kind of what you were saying, Richie, right, of like violence against the female gender. And in the second stanza where you get Hermione, which I looked up and translates to grandmother, you goes back to what you were saying, Vanessa, about the matriarchal culture that we see in this collection as well. I think language wise, it's really interesting too, because right from the first stanza, we get Cantonese, which is a Chinese language and spoken in Hong Kong, from what I was reading. So, right away you get that kind of, Mary Louise Pratt's style contact zone, right? And at the end, like you were saying, Richie, I do like that imagery of freedom and escape, and that the pun there on leak, right, as if it's a gas that's leaking as well from the pot. So yeah, it's an amazing poem to begin our discussion.
I mean, even the sound of like reading it out loud now, there's that the repetition of the vowel sounds that you hear a little bit. Leak, see, teeth, right? You also have like the hard consonants of leak and make. Yeah, just damn. I love when poets do this. I'm all gushing over here.
And so this is barely, the first poem, right? So were you all ready to go to the one right on the next page? Yeah, this is page 3. Yeah, so I wanted to say a few words about this one. So this one is called My Grandmother Thinks of Love While Steeping Tea, which is a great title, by the way. So you have a poem here that is organized in couplets. And, what drew me to this poem were my strong lines, I should say, in the last 2 couplets, which reads, pull the tongue of ginger into your mouth and suck. I mean for you to taste. And then, there's that line break, your inheritance, the gunpowder, or soil. So I really like how this poem, begins with the imagery that is, very gustatory. The ginger, sharp and sweet. The duja rind, the cold cinnamon, the clove, the dates. Drinking it all out, the sunk honey. So all of that, is just beautiful gustatory imagery. And then at the end here, that gustatory becomes something that is, about the land, right, and the passing down of things. We talked about this in the first episode, if you all recall, our listeners, that there's this running through line in this collection of generations passing down their culture, passing down the recipes, passing down knowledge, and passing down, pain and memories. In this case, the gunpowder to me just, that notion of colonialism, and whether it's the Korean War or the Japanese occupation, or just colonialism in general. And what you mentioned, Richie, last time about the diaspora, right? And how some of these things are passed down in the midst of violence. Yeah, so I really like that, that it's a kind of Volta to me at the end.
Yeah, I definitely liked that. I highlighted the same thing that you had done, and noted not just the use of the line break, but her use of enjambment, and I think that's nice there. Like your taste, or to taste, and then your spoke already so so well on that. So just other things I wanted to highlight about this particular poem is again the title, and the first couplet, the opening couplet, which I think is lovely too. It says, "Though you won't be sated, let me adore you in my way." A lot of people show love through cooking, through food,
Mm.
and well, it should be. I think we did mention this maybe as a connection in the first episode. It did remind me of that one, a couple of the short stories in Benjamin Sains's book collection. Everything begins and ends at the Kentucky Club, where you kind of see cooking as a type of care, as a type of love language. And so this is similar and in its own connection, right? And that's why I love poetry. I think to be able to pack in so much meaning, if done
Mhm.
well, in this case, I think it is, because when you unpack it, you can unravel and talk about so much. So yeah, like the last couplets you were talking about does just that. It sets up and brings up
Mhm.
ideas of colonialism and
Mhm.
land, its relation to land, and what we inherit through generations, even through food.
Exactly. Um, and I don't know if either of you two had the one that follows, Passage 1951.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Oh man, this one, so like so far the collection has started out so strong, but this one actually made me viscerally react.
Mm.
I exclaimed um not so kind words that I wouldn't mutter in public. By the way it hit me. And just I think the opening image is so wild. It works something so well. Let me just read it out loud so people can feel it. And it made me physically put my book down and just yell out, "Holy!" I just I don't know. Were we? I forget. Is this podcast supposed to be censored, uncensored? I can't remember.
I can just mark down if it's explicit or clean.
Don't tempt me with a good time. Okay, sorry. I should edit that part out. But anyway, yeah, it made me react, and so let me just read off that line. Once I saw shrapnel cut a woman's head clean off like a halved pill bug. Her legs kept carrying her a while from this world into the next. And when she finally succumbed, the baby strapped to her back tumbled out like a squash during good harvest. Leave me breathless still, even just reading it there. That's some imagery. Not just physical, but some of the similes and metaphors she kind of puts into this image. And it sets up an environment of survival, of running, and violence, and it's a certain kind of way of living, of survival, that a lot of us may not understand. And so sometimes when we think about the word hunger, someone's hunger is not our hunger. And in this case, she definitely makes that point. In wartime, in battle, in chaos, she's talking about her and her siblings just trying to survive. And the kind of hunger that is a hunger that we do not know. I do not know. I feared, she mentions these a couple of lines that stand out to me. I feared we would never unwild ourselves. I think that's a great way of putting it too. Unwild. And then she talks about, stealing food, finding food. We grew to love the iron and death. My sister began to smile while looting bodies, and the sight of her put freeze in me. So that in itself is pretty like bone trembling, right? That kind of what kind of smile this might be. But then again, her last line just has this kick, hits me. It was only after seeing her I knew what my own mouth was doing. So it's also out of this where my ignorance, I had to go and look up the Korean War, and um yeah, this poem did something for me in terms of that type of setting the rest of the book up as well.
Yeah, man, I really liked how you what your commentary in how this poem struck you, right? And I think it's one of the things about the power of the written word is, how it's just able to move you. And you know all it takes is one stanza. um I think to me, I also was thinking about that, the historical context and the Korean War, and the survival, right, that that they had to do, right. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of like, just right now, right, because a lot of people during the pandemic right now are suffering and going hungry, because they're unable to work, or they lost their job. um Except in this case, there's a whole war around them, right? And I think there's a certain, I don't know. I just think it's really interesting how Jung is able to um, integrate this imagery by, whatever grenade went off here, right? That ended up decapitating the woman. It becomes something else, right? And um, I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but just yeah, I think it's definitely a breathtaking poem in and of itself.
Even just kind of seeing yourself and other people kind of comes out, and observing what state this situation has put her sister into, and realizing that this is
Mhm.
also herself hits particularly well.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And also, like, we don't get it here yet, but I mean, there's also, it's mentioned in other poems, and I guess we will get to them. But there's also just the threat of them being women, and even though they're children, it's definitely mentioned that um, there's other types of violence.
right. And just the need for survival, right? They're taking what they can, because it's a war zone, right? And I remember, with the Black Lives Matters protests, that a lot of people were saying that, the connotation of looting is that, it's stealing, right? But a lot of it is just plain survival, and there's a difference, I think, between what some people think is looting is really just another person's scavenging. um and so yeah, I think from that perspective, for the classroom, it would be an interesting discussion of how, when those protests were going on, right, and people were going into the store, it wasn't out of spite, right? It was just that, or to make a scene or whatever. It was because they actually needed, diapers or whatever, food. um so I think there's that too, that the politicization of survival and the shaming that goes with that, especially because so much of that is now, on tape, right? Versus, here in the Korean War, it's the only way that we get the recording is through history books and poems like this.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, history books is one thing, absolutely. And then I love in art, like poetry and writing, you're able to also inject emotion, pathos into your work, which I think can definitely um have a much more stronger effect sometimes on the reader.
For sure. um and it's interesting, this is Passage 1951, and the poem right after is also a 1951 poem, Bone Soup. So it goes from that war imagery of survival to, you know uh, another of the themes of the poems is how, going back to the first poem, the nature of food. um I don't know if any of you had this one, or if y'all wanted to go to the one in the page across it. For now, nothing burns.
Well, I mean, I think it's a good companion to the previous one, and it just again framing it as this is a hunger that many of us might not know.
Hmm.
It just it's described well, but I think for the sake of maybe podcast time, we can go on.
Sure. Well, I had this next poem then on page 7. For now, nothing burns, and it begins with an epigraph from a Harlem Renaissance writer, Jean Toomer, um, quoting from Kane here: "Stir the root life of a wayward people, call them from their houses, and teach them to dream." Um, it's one of those poems where the lines are displaced and arranged in their own form. Um, and what my strong lines for this one were at the bottom of this page and the page that follows. Um, Call it sanctuary, call us lotus. We bloom and brought, rise bog-bodied into tomorrow. When we get there, I will beg for rations, feed you corn syrup, spoonful after sweet, mournful spoonful. Um, it's a poem that begins, by talking about a wreckage and, escape, right? Trying to seek shelter and safety. Um, and then it goes into this imagery here at the end of a kind of rebirth, um, and ends there with again the running theme of this collection of food, of where it's rations and it's just corn syrup, right? um, and yet within that consumption, of course that there's mourning, right? And they've lost family or what have you. um, so I really like that the poem because of how it's able to speak about the ritual of you know getting spoonfuls of this sustenance, and yet at the same time it's almost like an offering in a way, because it's trying to move on from what just happened.
Did you have anything for this one, Vanessa?
Mhm. Well, towards the beginning, where it says, "The people strewn around us are not people, only reservoirs, pumping into one great vein." Um, and we haven't really. I interpreted these three poems, "Passage," "Bone Soup," and "For Now Nothing Burns." I interpreted them talking about like immigration too, not only wartime. So I kind of
Mm.
connected it to people who are immigrating to the U.S.
Hmm.
So this one, I kind of thought about um, like people that travel in groups together
Mm.
to kind of get to the border.
Hmm.
So I thought of that, like the people strewn around us, like all the people that are traveling together, they're all going to one place, and they think. And later it says safety is not far. I think because they're definitely trying to escape something, and that's why they're trying to leave where they are and for a better life for themselves and their family.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm glad I asked you too because I was gonna bring up the exact same line that you um in connection also to this element of, I guess, using imagination to escape or to dream. You
Mm,
see it in the tumor part here in this poem, uh the beginning of the whole book as well, like we mentioned. But what from the line that you read, also what I actually did underline was the continuation of that. Talking about the people strewn around them as reservoirs pumping one great vein, like kind of like the way we're all connected as
Mm.
maybe like a culture of
mm,
people. But the line
mhm,
that I think is interesting that I highlighted is, "What's spilled is a river we must follow." So it's just kind of like the survivors kind of like that river we must follow. I think is just like we're always saying, like, how do we continue this journey of survival? In many ways, it's like about
Mm,
sacrifice, and that's a theme that we've talked about for many. I
mhm.
think it's a theme that's mentioned in many of the other books we've read, especially, kind of generational sacrifice when it comes to immigration. So I see what you're saying there, Vanessa. And in this case, right, in the the yeah, again, just like kind of like a war torn country,
Mhm.
also that kind of escape. And of course, I also highlighted the part that you called attention to, Jorge.
Yeah.
Um, we rise bog bodied into tomorrow is a freaking nice line, and then just even the image of getting that sustenance, corn syrup. I think like in the U.S., when like some people were like corn syrup, get that out of your diet and stuff like. But it's just like again, it's a different kind of hunger.
Hmm.
I do like the way it complements is almost like an ending of these three poems.
For sure. And it's a respite, at the title, for now, right? And so whatever conflagration, whatever explosion from the war, just happened, um, there's ash, right? And there's the exodus, like you were saying, Vanessa, about seeking asylum, right? Seeking safety and sanctuary, and um, it goes from 1951 to on page 9. If y'all wanted to go to the next one, Diptych of Girl in 1953. And pre-show, I know that you said, Vanessa, that you had some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I just think this one's really about like the sacrifices or like the things that women put themselves through in order to have this better life, like especially people who are like women who are migrating and trying to find seek asylum.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in the second and third stanza, it says, "Somehow I was a virgin before this. They call me Western wife or rag." Um, and I think that women put themselves in the or allow men to use them in order to be able to make it to the sanctuary. Because I mean, not everyone does make it. Like a lot of people do die, and I think like in in Passage, I think that that's pretty common in like like groups that are migrating. Like
Mm-hmm.
people are looting the other bodies of the people who are killed or die from like dehydration or like starvation,
Right.
heat exhaustion, possibly even. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of women allow themselves to be used by men when they're making this voyage, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I just wanted to mention that in comparison to like the other poems.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think it definitely rings true again about how violence against women is perpetrated across these migrant in some ways these I guess could be interpreted as migrant poems, and except it's migration from the east. um
Mm-hmm.
and it is interesting how there's a kind of, I guess, from the stanzas that you read, of commodification, because it says, like you said, right, this idea of a Western wife, and it says a little after, um, soon I will follow a white man to America, his war relic bride. How to tell you without waking, trust. And the poem is addressed to the speaker's baby brother, right? So it's also this kind of passing down, right, of this knowledge. to the brother. And I think it's interesting that it's a baby brother, because it implies, that this even though the brother is a man, I mean, is a male, they're still innocent, and therefore still able to kind of learn about how, the patriarchal views of so many cultures end up, commodifying women in this way. um, and my strong line, at the end in the third stanza, was where it says, "Tell me again of love and its dark mirrors, well-skinned pair, our cheeks in the dust, the wet shred of a body, your voice carrying clear over the threshold. Sister, welcome home before you turn to embrace me." Um, and it's just a beautiful imagery there, of this, the duality of love, and the how this woman going across this journey is able to find, um, that sanctuary, right, and a home. And again, it's a sister that she finds it with, not with a man, right, or like the white man that is mentioned in the previous stanza.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was thinking about the date too. The date 1953 is the date when the Korean War unofficially ended. So I guess the ceasefire, or what have you. So it implies that there's this peace, that the speaker is able to attain, as it mentions in the last stanza too.
Yeah.
Did y'all want to jump to the next one, or Richie, did you want to add anything?
I can, but I think there's other poems. Like, I'll just say, like, I had the same strong line that you did.
That Vanessa did, as usual?
Oh, no, that you did.
Oh. Well, that's a first. Well, I had the next one, field notes from my grandparents. And my strong line, was in the first stanza, that says right at the very top, "This ghost I know by name. Father, I wanted your feet in a basin of silted river before I fled across the border." And then later on, there's an address here that says, "Dear Young Hee, fate is a lazy man's fever dream." And so just going back to what you were saying, Vanessa, I think this is the longest poem so far. But just even from the first stanza, it goes back again to migration. And, of course, us being here in El Paso, I couldn't help but make the connection of the Rio Grande and so many migrants, crossing it, right? And, traversing the dangerous river and the desert, of course, because the wall makes it such. And I think there's also this, again, given that it's grandparents, this is being passed down to the speaker, and such that it's portrayed as field notes, right, implying that these are notes taken from the wartime, and because of they have to flee, right, and become refugees. So I really like the poem because of that. Yeah, so those were my thoughts just from the very beginning of the poem.
Yeah, I have something on that first stanza as well. I don't know if you did, Vanessa.
No, I didn't really have any notes on this one.
Okay. Yeah, and the very first stanza, I mean, so yes, absolutely to all that you said, and the very end of that stanza, I think, is important, and it resonates again throughout the entire collection. And again, I was fascinated by the connections between poems, and this one I think is one of the prominent that I think will be better to talk about in the next episode when we talk about the second half of the book. But I do want to set it up. So yeah, that stanza ends after the note that you read. In our village, the clot of hunger never loosened. When I fled without returning you to earth, you did not resent me. Please say it. You did not resent me. I think it's an interesting kind of conversation. I think, and again, so you're talking about like again intergenerational, the things we carry, including kind of like that hunger as a theme. Being in the village, that kind of hunger never loosened. But I love this. It's not even like a question, like please say you don't resent me, but rather it's an acknowledgement that there was never returning you to earth. I put a star next to this, and it connects to something in the second part of the book. I don't know if you guys saw that connection, but we'll talk about it the next episode.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, as the poem progresses, it goes into the actual the war setting, right? And so the imagery here, such as my leg darkened with rot, after, and it's just really interesting how the bombs are portrayed as eggs in the previous stanza, where it says, the planes dropped their eggs, hashed the red so loud the landscape was struck briefly mute.
I love the imagery of another one where it says, even newly out of war, we are afflicted with spring. A flower grows through the hinge of a bone, all stem and snapdragon.
Yeah, I was trying to find.
It's on the next page on 13. Great imagery packed into these stanzas here on these pages. And I like the way they're scattered about as well.
Yeah, I really like the Jung's juxtaposition of the war imagery with the food. Going back to the corn syrup, here we get on that last page, the third to last stanza, baking soda and sugar melted into brown shapes by street side vendors. So yeah, it's just a very powerful, and I think the juxtaposition makes sense, right? Because the culture here is so interlinked with their food, and the food is it speaks to the pride and the survival because of the war. If you all flip the page, we get a poem titled Immigration. And I had some thoughts on this one. I'm sure you all did too. But I had the second and third stanza. I don't know if any of you had the first.
I just had a line in the first one. Towards the end of the stanza, it says, "They look and see, hardly human." And that one, I underlined that one because I think that a lot of people look at other cultures and people who don't look like them and see them as less than, I think. And so that line really resonated with me. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, Vanessa, how I think there was another poem where the speaker is addressing the sun, and I guess there could also be, of course, the pun there, right? But I think it reminds me of Book 4 of Paradise Lost, where Satan has a soliloquy towards the sun. And for me, the second stanza jumped out with the line that says, when they reached, did you think of loaches dying between your thighs? And then it goes on, how they gorged and writhed as you boiled them along the river rock of your childhood stream. the burnished pot frothing its red and copper. The men will live to callous their hands further. Son, in this life I will be your daughter, and you will teach me how to run. And that last line is isolated, right? And I think that's an interesting positioning for it. Makes it a kind of volta on its own right. But once again, I do really like that imagery of the food that is, in this case, a memory, and the men here that are mentioned with their callous hands, and the personification of the son, as something that will have a daughter. So yeah, I that's what I really liked about this poem. And of course, just that it's a poem, titled Immigration, and we've talked a lot about immigration poems with Citizen Illegal, and so I think it's interesting to kind of get this different take on it.
Yeah.
We had on 16, I don't know if any of you had homonyms.
Mm-mm.
I mean, I had a few kind of things I had underlined and made note of, but I don't know. Did you?
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah, go ahead and start it off, man.
So yeah, first, the epigraph provides us with the Korean characters Hangul, and the word here is in English is we'll spell that Teyuda, and so it's interesting how Jung gets the homonyms here that for letter A means to burn or singe by fire, and then B, to carry, give a ride, pick up, right? And so they're almost separate meanings, right? And for me, the strong line is towards the bottom where it says, you did until your girlhood grew dangerous as it does for all girls. I've been sorry ever since. You burnt on the coattails of our immigration, singed your tongue on America until no tongue was rightfully yours, until you came home disgraced, having pissed yourself instead of asking to go to the restroom in English. But I wasn't ashamed. I burned you gently in my arms, burned you all the way home. And daughter, you will not forget these aches you learned. If you have a daughter, you will burn her too. So I really like how Jung takes the Tayuda here and makes a poem out of it that references the assimilation. And, again, we get that gustatory imagery of the tongue, and how it, becomes singed. The situation of, pride, in speaking the tongue, I think many immigrants can relate to that, right? Is sometimes there is that shame that is attached to not speaking your home language, or not being able to speak your non-native language, right? The language that you immigrate to. So yeah, I really like how, just with that word itself, right? It's both a burning of your, whatever your mother tongue is, but also picking up that new tongue at the same time.
Yeah, man. This is I love the way that Jung interrogates language, or like the meanings behind words, and in this case, I guess the polysemy of it all. Like, we can attach different meanings here, as clearly stated, and it's awesome. Again, I actually put a star next to the exactly where you started reading from this poem. for the same reason. And so, I think you pointed out pretty well enough what I picked up on that as well. I also did like, just kind of the call to motherhood and having daughters. And um, I liked at the beginning of the poem, there's like just kind of the reference of like natural remedies,
Mm.
Mm.
jaundice thing. So she's like sick. And so to kind of remedy, she had her suck the milk of dandelions, sliced antlers rendered to tea, um, to help with coughing. And I think going back to like maybe making tea is that kind of care as well. And she only has the hope for her, but she knows as she grows older, things are gonna get harder. And it's just kind of one of those recognitions, I think, in this poem.
Yeah, I mean, what you mentioned there, I think there's also that idea of when the girl matures and becomes a woman, right? That lines that say, "I dislodge your limbs in hopes you grow to something live and desired," the suggestion of a girl, right? And that the idea of girlhood being dangerous as well.
I think that's actually the line I was referencing when we were talking about passage 1951.
Mm,
Sisters and they're surviving in this war zone, but this is a kind of war that goes on and perpetuates in reference here.
yeah. Um, yeah, so that's homonyms. And after it is, I don't know if either of you two had I Revisit Myself in 1996.
Vanessa?
Um, hmm. I I didn't have a specific line really in this one. I just like that it's a memory, and she's kind of putting herself back in like her innocence, I guess. Um, I liked the towards the end, the last four lines. Um, she says, "I've seen Halamoni erect enough garlic stems and carrot roots to know how this works. I cover the bones in soil and wait for pigs to grow." Um, I think that one's so cute because she grabs the ham hocks from the trash can and decides to go plant them. And she's waiting for pigs to come from from that, and I think that that's so cute. Because she's seen her grandmother do it with garlic stems and carrot roots.
Mhm.
So she's like, "Oh, well, then this is how you get more of this thing." So I think that one's so cute.
Yeah, I highlighted several lines, including that one, but there's some that I loved. English has just begun to bruise my tongue, but and I guess it's important. Like now we have a poem where it seems like the setting is now the U.S. California as opposed to Korea, and again, just some of the lines that I really appreciate when talking about like the weather, like California, it's sunny all the time. And then she says, "Except at night when God throws stars like darts and punctures the ground sometimes." Sounded
Mm.
nice, is nice. And of course, the last lines that Vanessa read, and wait for pigs to grow. That kind of made me think of Milton. I don't know if you doesn't he do that in Paradise Lost when he kind of inverts
Mm,
creation,
mhm,
and he describes animals growing out of the ground like plants.
mhm. Yeah, I think you're right. Oh, that's already the second Milton connection.
I had to ask the Miltonian over here to see if he agreed with my guess.
Well, and it nicely aligns, with the previous poem, right? Because it's talking about growth and life, and yes, and migration as well, right? And kind of the beginning of the deassimilation, right? That there's a resistance there, right? And but by saying, "But I am all Korean." I thought that that's reminds me a lot of Jose Olivares.
Oh yeah, yeah. I could
Um, if we turn the page, we get the first, I think this is the first recipe poem. And it's aptly named War Soup. We talked about this in the first episode, right? About how Jung integrates recipes into and makes them poems. I really like this one and how it's able to do that. It's able to become a poem. Just looking at the ingredients, you get the pork belly, right? Going back to that pig that was going, and but you also get American cheese, which is interesting, and takes us to the war soup and colonization, and I also liked number 5, then spam, more tofu than animal, cut to cube. Say, we may do with what we did. At the basis, the Americans gave cans of beans or meat. We weren't picky, boiled it all with weeds and scraped carcass. We called that Johnson Tang. Rejoiced like we never again need to eat, as if the miles were no real thing. Now chili, now green onion sprigs. So the hunger again, right, that we've been talking about, with something like spam and just making do with what they have, right, beans, etc., carcasses. Again, goes back to that survival, and it's also an offering, because it's italicized there, and it's something that is now becomes part of the recipe.
I highlighted actually, yeah, I highlighted all of 5, like you pointed out, and I pretty much, yeah, again, a lot of same things during the ingredients. I highlighted the fact that it's American cheese in the recipe now, and then I also marked down where it takes on the look of a normal recipe, but I started highlighting where it starts to kind of transition, like it starts to kind of blend into something else, into a poem, starting with, I think, 2, onion carpeted in pork fat and rice wine flared very briefly, an ignited landscape. Like, okay, now you wouldn't start to see that in a recipe book. Like, wait, what? How? An ignited landscape. And I think even at the end of that, set it all to boil, no witness, low heat. So it starts to transform until eventually 4 and 5. You have these interjections that are pretty great. I highlight all of 5 for the same reason that you did. And the last stanza in as well, in 7, right, where, what a blessing to have passed through hunger. I will teach my daughters to bear their palms. I will teach them how to beg. Yeah, and as you mentioned, it's the first recipe poem called War Soup, and we see this a couple more times throughout.
Yeah, and we've seen that begging as well, right? The begging of rations, being war survivors, war refugees. And again, going back to the American cheese, not to harp on that, but I also wanted to say that, it's not even real cheese, right? And just like the spam, there's a certain artificialness to the food that becomes part of this recipe because it's kind of like a symbolic colonization of the cultural recipe, right? It's been tainted, by the American cheese and by the spam.
Plastic and like the leftovers of all the other foods.
Yeah, I like that line. More tofu than animal. I hadn't thought about insulting spam by, connecting it to, something that would be vegan, right? So yeah, just really, really interesting way of using food. Did you all have the next one, daughter transmorphic? I think one of you mentioned it.
I did. I don't know if you did, Vanessa.
Vanessa, you there?
Yes, I'm re-looking at it. Sorry.
Oh.
No, I don't really have anything specific to add to this or to talk about for this one.
Yeah. There's a little bit of like meta narrative going on as we're reading this book about women and kind of matrilineages, as she says here. Yeah, there's just some strong lines that I liked. Like, Mama, if lore has taught me anything, I know queendoms, like language, can't last long childless. I think is strong enough in its own merit. And then it continues, why must all tired stories start with an exit of the mother? A matrilineage expunged and covered in moths, nothing mouthing what's left. Flip the page. Gone is the matriarch. Close the book, and blood seeps between chapters. Now, men with bayonets. Tomorrow, dogs. In no version are they not hunting us. So it just, I think, just very in your face, kind of bringing this theme out. And like I said, it's just almost very meta narrative of us reading it and asking us, flip the page, blood seeps out between chapters. Like, it's that much of enough to call to.
And as you were saying that, Richie, it reminded me of Grise's collection, because of, remember how there was the short story, forget what it's called, but about or just in general, right, the men as predators and the woman as prey. And so here the idea of them being hunted, right, because the matriarch is gone. And I think it really speaks to that, the importance of a matriarchal society and its valuing of women as a kind of protection and the passing down, right, of that knowledge for them.
Yeah, and I like how she also brings up language as well. And I think one of my favorite poems is a little later on, where it's another recipe poem that brings up language.
Well, we have two other ones right next to each other, Yellow Fever and Saga of the Nymph and the Woodcutter. Did either of you have either of these two?
I have stuff highlighted, but I'll only add if you guys.
No, I mean, my next one was Recipe, actually, the one called Recipe.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. My next one is on page 32.
You said you had no, you said you had Recipe?
Yeah, I had Recipe.
So did I. I think the same thing, obviously, so.
So first, the recipe itself, it's in Hangul, and I don't know what it says, right? So the ingredients, so we have whole chicken, soy sauce. These are I guess pretty standard ingredients, and it's interesting, even just going off to the first step. Again, we get the hen, the caressing of the carcass, but then you get to number 3, and it says peel the ninjin. Grandma says in Japanese, though she means dagenun or carrot in Korean. She mistakes the two often, so I know what she means. And it says, the skin curls beneath the paring knife's persuasion as I think of colonization via inheritance, via memory. These words have no reason to know but do. Going back to what we talked about the occupation of Korea by Japan, and how here, it results in this, the grandmother, using the Japanese word for carrot, and how, just like for us here in the border, right, with English and Spanish, you use the two interchangeably, right? So there's a kind of code switching when referring to the same thing. and that's just kind of the beginning of it, because I had the last two, I mean, the last three steps as well, where it goes more into that, basically saying, she calls us to Dak Doritan despite controversy. Some believe it roughly translates into chicken stew. Dak meaning chicken in Korean. Dori derived from Japanese chori, bird. A slim silhouette of occupation tethered to our language like a haunting. And I just really love that line. Others say this is not true. Rather, they posit the etymological root of Dori lies and then it's dango there characters, and then it says to cut out or discard. After decades come and gone, grammar cannot discard Japanese. Our tongues boiled down to language, broth skimmed of fat. During occupation, this was dangerous. And I could go on, but I'll stop there because it is quite a bit. But I just want to emphasize that, how this recipe becomes a whole other thing really in relation to the occupation, to language, how language becomes blended with one another, right? The colonizer language and the language of the colonized, evident in this recipe, and how the grandmother cannot yet do away with the colonizer language. So yeah, I'll stop there, but there's a lot in this one.
Yeah, those are the exact passages I had highlighted, because I think it is fascinating how she brings it up in 3. And I love the simplicity of how step 4 is just a parenthetical note, a tongue cleaved with trying, which I think is a succinct way of talking about this concept, as both literal and metaphorical, right? A tongue cleaved with trying. And then 6 I think is the passage I draw stars next to, like the heavy, like, yeah, that's it, this is the one we're going to talk about for sure kind of line. And I absolutely love that line as well. A slim silhouette of occupation tethered to our language like a haunting, because it does language does this, right? I mean, when we, as people who study language, we understand that it's always changing, adapting, and a lot of that, some of that is always also through war, through conquest, through colonization. So it's always interesting to look at the etymology and reason for why words are the way they are. And so I really appreciate and love that Jung does this in these recipe poems, in particular this one. And this one I really loved as well.
Yeah. And just for the sake of time, I know you mentioned this next one, Richie, the diptych of animal and womb, the second diptych already, but you mentioned this one in the first episode, so I don't know if you wanted to talk about it.
Well, I mean, it's definitely worth, I think, maybe diving into. It's one of the more interesting ones. But I think, again, for the sake of time, because I know we're nearing definitely over an hour now.
Yeah.
So, and I know I want to get to, I think we're a couple poems from finishing this episode, and I know Vanessa had one. So I don't know. I just definitely recommend people to read it and check it out. And we did mention in this case, it starts with the epigraph to, it references Reddit, and which I thought it's a pretty misogynistic quote. And so it's her response, and I think as the artist, it is our call to respond to these things in the world that, it's like our response is necessary. So, I mean, I love that she's done this, of animal and womb. But maybe we can explore a little later, but I definitely want to make sure we have time to get to these other pieces. Because I think, Vanessa, you said you had 32?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't have a specific line for this one. But this one, I had to stop reading for a second. I basically almost cried reading this one. I just, so it's called Mother Undresses. And the speaker is just kind of talking about the scars that she sees on her mother. And I don't know. This one was really hard for me to read. But I feel like it's a really good poem.
Were there strong lines in particular, Vanessa, that you wanted to highlight?
It says, "Look what the fever did. So I look, and I see her mottled gosling thing, covered in blood-red blossoming she calls yellow, not flowers of fever, flowers of contagion that have rendered her grotesque." I don't know. I think the imagery is really strong in this poem because I was able to picture this woman like covered in these scars and yeah, I don't know.
I mean, there's a lot to be said about like this idea of undressing. Like, there's a little undressing, but there's also maybe an emotional. There's that line where she says, "I'm surprised. I've never known them, but she withholds so many things."
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot in these scars and these marks on her mother's body.
Yeah.
And I was looking up that phrase "yo ka," and what actually popped up on Google was Jung's book first, so that was like the first result. But it's an interesting concept that we've seen again the blending of this kind of the blooming, right? I can't remember which other poem it was, but just this idea of growth, right? But it's kind of interesting how it kind of represents this as this kind of violent imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And again, just the anaphora there of that bastard. And it's kind of interesting, it says, and remember, she means the fever. But it's interesting how it's kind of just gendered that way.
I mean, even the fever, like, references, I think we skipped it, but there's the poem earlier on yellow fever.
Right. Well, I think maybe we can stop there, and finish the rest of this collection in our next episode, I should say. Well, just to the listeners, I'll say, as we usually say, if you're able to pick up this collection from your local bookstore, and I think we're just about ready to release that playlist. So keep an eye on Instagram, like we were saying in our first episode. And if you all want to contribute your songs to this collection, right, Vanessa? Is that what we're gonna do?
Yes. Mm-hmm. It'll be through my Spotify, I guess. But I'll link it in our social media pages.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you all for listening in. This was a long discussion, and we're only halfway there. But we'll resume with the second half in our next episode.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, brought to you by Border Census and Power at the Past. We discussed Some Are Always Hungry by Jun Young. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.